Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second lecture of the Racial Justice Initiative Speaker Series. The Racial Justice Initiative was established by President Oliver in the wake of the George Floyd murders and the ongoing racial violence experienced by African Americans. One of the things that we know from the speakers we've been inviting to campus, what we see in the news, FBI statistics, is that racialized violence is not only directed at African Americans, but other communities of color, other marginalized groups are also facing racialized violence. We're talking about Latinos, Muslim Americans, Asian Americans, and of course, Native people. It is my pleasure to welcome Dina Gilio-Whitaker to our panel today. Dina Gilio-Whitaker is of the Colville Confederated Tribes, is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at Cal State San Marcos. She is an independent educator in American Indian environmental policy and other issues. Gilio-Whitaker is the author of 2 books, including the award-winning book, As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. She is an educator, a scholar, a public intellectual, and an activist. Welcome, Dina. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. I will turn it over to you, and then we will open it up to Q&A.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Adrian. Y Pisnaksiok, Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and I am coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ahashiman Nation in what's currently called Orange County in Southern California. And as Professor Pantoja says, I am a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Sinixt band. I am related through a long line of families on the reservation. But I was born and raised in Los Angeles. So I have never lived in my tribal community. I am that first generation of Native people who were impacted by the federal government's termination policy in the 1950s and 60s. And so that's how I come, to be born and raised in LA during that time period. So let's see, I have a PowerPoint to share with you, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you now and dive in. So I would like to talk to you about what indigenizing environmental justice looks like and decolonizing. And these are 2 different things. They sometimes are used interchangeably, but I just using that as a framework to talk about this larger project that has resulted in this book, As Long as Grass Grows. So when I started this project, it really began as, it began when I was a student, an undergrad student, probably like many of you in the audience right now. I was in American Indian Studies, getting a bachelor's, and I had come to school as a non-traditional student, older student. And I was very passionate about, not just as a Native person about studying, going into American Indian Studies, but also I was very motivated and driven by environmentalism, going back decades, at least to the 80s for me, and caring about the environment and learning about it and just wanting to know more. At that time, we started hearing about, what we at the time called global warming. We didn't really call it climate change at the time, but this is what really got my attention. And so I just kept on learning about those topics. And when I got into school and I was taking as many, I was in this American Indian Studies program at the University of New Mexico. And then I was taking courses on environmentalism too, but within the American Indian Studies department, there was a course that I took called Environmental Justice. And at that time, I didn't know what environmental justice was. but I, learned about it from within the Native American Studies perspective. And at that time, which was about 2007, I guess, it was still a kind of an emerging conversation for Native people. It was had been, I didn't know about it, and I could tell by the way that the course was put together, there was not very much material that I was studying that was written by Native scholars. There was only a handful, and we were reading kind of peripherally related material. And so I had the sense then that this was, a pretty emergent discourse in Native studies. And so then I got into grad school. I was on the same campus in American Studies, and I took another course. They offered in that program a course on environmental justice, but of course it was a grad level course. And I noticed in that class that we read no Native scholars at all. There was virtually no perspective on American Indians and what we call environmental justice. And I learned that by that time, that this thing that we call environmental justice had been around since the early 1980s. So it was a pretty well-established, certainly discourse, but also a theory, an academic field of study and law and policy. And so I was learning about all of that stuff. But I also brought with me my perspective from American Indian Studies, which really hinges on, our theoretical foundation of colonialism. And none of that, that was not part of what I was learning about environmental justice in this program. What I learned about in that program was that environmental justice, or EJ, hinges on a concept that's called environmental racism. And environmental racism says that people of color are targeted in various ways by industry that exposes them to greater risk and harm and illness, and because of mostly toxic industries. So that's really what it kind of boiled down to. It begins in the South, early 1980s, 1982, 1983, where Black communities are being targeted for, toxic waste dumps. And they believe that they're being intentionally targeted because they're poor and they're relatively powerless. That gives birth to this entire topic we call environmental justice. And so, they start by holding community studies, creating their own studies in their communities to find out, and test this hypothesis of whether or not environmental racism is really a thing. Well, years later, it turns out that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that yes, this is true. Communities of color in certain areas are targeted in these very racist ways. For toxic development. So, but knowing what I knew in American Indian Studies about our history with colonialism and our history with genocide and our history with land dispossession and all the things that we talk about, that was not reflected in any of the literature. And so I set out to bring the two into conversation with each other. And this is what we want to do as scholars, as people doing research. We want to find those areas where the literature is sparse, or it really needs to be filled in, to make some kind of intervention. So that was my goal with this book. With the study. So, because originally it began as a master's thesis, and it was that master's thesis where I theorized this indigenization of EJ by bringing in settler colonial theory and indigenous knowledge into that conversation by asking the question, what does environmental justice look like when American Indian voices are centered? So turns out it's a really much different conversation. And I argued in it that that unless the American Indian experience with settler colonialism and dispossession, land theft and genocide, unless all of that is factored in to that which we call environmental justice, it's really non going to be responsive to Native communities, and that it also has to acknowledge the political difference of American Indian communities as nations, not ethnic minorities, because the racializing, the reliance on racializing people or using the analysis of racial discrimination to describe these problems is really, it's actually a problem for American Indian people. It's very limiting and it's harmful in ways that I don't want to, it's a big conversation that I don't want to get into at this point. But suffices to say that this political talking about the nationhood of Native people really signals political difference, because it's American Indian people are the only people in the US to have this political relationship to the state, to the US, and are not ethnic minorities. So that's critically important. And that's, if we're going to talk about indigenizing EJ, that has to be central. So eventually this chapter, or the master's thesis, turned into, it became the seed for this book, because after I got out of grad school, I kept writing, all throughout grad school, I was writing about what environmental justice was. All of that became foundational to the work that I kept doing as a journalist and as a scholar working in a nonprofit, an Indigenous nonprofit policy research center. So I just kept doing that research for all those years after grad school. And then Standing Rock happened in 2016. And by then I had already written my first book, co-authored with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And then the publisher, Beacon Press, had come to me and said, what is, with Standing Rock, in the news, they had said, what does environmental justice look like for Native people? And of course, Standing Rock was the perfect example. And so it was just the convergence of all these circumstances that became the perfect moment to write this book. So that's how the book comes together. So kind of unpacking all of that, how to bring some kind of highlight the main points of this way of theorizing an indigenized environmental justice framework. I really like to use the example of this painting, because I think this painting is something that's so familiar to most, if not all of us. We've all seen this painting at some time in our lives, and it really is, it's John Gast's 1872 painting called American Progress. And it serves as such a great point of analysis, because we can deconstruct the image to get to the root message of it, and it's all explicit in the image, which is captured by the central figure here, who has a name, and her name is Columbia. Gee, I wonder where that came from. We all know, but we are tempted to think in this image that Columbia is an angel, right? She's sort of angelic appearing. She's in white robes, usually, that's sort of like an angel outfit. And the flowing robe sort of implies, wings, but they're not really wings. They're just, but it hints, it leans in that direction. She's very fair skinned. She's obviously racially white. She holds a book in her hand, and we're tempted to think that maybe that's a Bible, but it's not. It's actually, it says on there, education. So the religious undertones here are pretty glaring. But she also has on her arm a roll of wire, and you can see the wire connecting what we presume to be a telegraph line. And over to the, if we look at the larger picture, over in the east, to the right part of the image is the rising sun. We know that's the east, the sun rises in the east. We see, we see urbanization, we see technology, we see, boats, and we see a bridge, and we see a built environment. And we also see railroads on the ground. And of course, the telegraph lines. We see she appears to be, bringing the light with her as she heads to the east. And as she, the message here is, she's bringing with her technology, and technology is, represented by light as she heads toward the west, seeming to chase out the darkness. And we see coming with her a new people. These are, people with modern farming implements. They are farmers. They are gold miners. They are people in covered wagons. They're the intrepid pioneers, and they seem to be chasing out, the old populations, the Indians, the wild animals, the buffalo and the bear and the wolf are all there. And they seem to be, the Indians are looking back, seeming to be in fear of this. So the message is really clear that that these older societies are being moved out. This is Western expansion. This is made manifest in this image. This is a manifest destiny and settler colonialism in action. And the message of this image is what has turned into a structure that we call settler colonialism. We say that settler colonialism is about the elimination of the native in order to replace. So settler populations come, eliminate native populations in order to replace them on the land. And the way that this has been done historically through historical narratives, and even in the creation of the legal system, is that it happens, it's justified, it's profoundly violent. You don't get that sense in this image. It all seems pretty benign and pretty nice, but it's a profoundly violent process. And in order to justify that violence, Indigenous people and nations must be constructed as inferior in order to rationalize and legitimize this taking of the land. And all of that, the legitimization of that through the legal system happens beginning in 1823 with the first Supreme Court case ever argued about American Indians, which had to do with establishing clear land titles. Not surprisingly, the new country needed to figure out how to basically cover its tracks and have clear land titles in this European model. And so that gives birth to something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which is still the foundation of federal Indian law, in which Native people have no rights to the land. Literally, we do not own titles to our own lands that we reserved in treaties. And so this gave birth to, an entire complicated legal system that the federal government uses to govern all of our lands and all of our lives. And so it's very paternalistic. It's this hegemonic relationship, and it's fundamentally genocidal, because if we say settler colonialism is about eliminating the native population, then it's always already ongoingly genocidal for native people in a huge variety of subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. So how might we talk about that, like the genocidal nature of this history. I mean, we know of, you know, certainly the flat out killing of Native people has been genocidal toward American Indian populations, but one of the ways that was carried out was through the remaking of the landscape as Europeans marched westward and, you know, pushed the original inhabitants out of the way, because of course Native people were seen as obstacles. This is all about progress, right? Western expansion is all about progress, about narrating, you know, a supreme society who are, you know, supreme and superior because of their technology and also because of their race. And so this industrial revolution, as it, you know, sweeps its way westward across the continent, remakes the landscape in some very particular cultural ways. So we can talk about this in terms of cultural landscapes and the ways that technology was put to use in way that was designed to benefit the settler population, but ultimately is genocidal to indigenous populations. And you know, we talk about these processes of ecocide. So, you know, this is about modernity, about Europeans bringing their technology to build this new society, and what it does is it produces these ecocidal impacts on the land. And because Native people are so connected to the land, these ecocidal processes are genocidal for them, while, in other words, while it's bringing life, or the conditions of life for settler populations, it's bringing the conditions of death for Native people. And the images that I have here are really clear examples. Here are countless examples that we can name about this in 400 or 500 years of colonialism. But all of these examples exist within the 20th century and are particularly poignant for the stories that they tell. In the image on the left, you know, we see the Missouri River watershed. What happens in the Missouri River, on the Missouri River, spanning North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, is the Missouri River is a massive river, a huge watershed in the Midwest, in this part of the Northern Plains. And it's the homeland to what used to be called the Great Sioux Nation. The federal government made treaties with the Great Sioux Nation, and the initial treaty in 1851 was a land set aside. So reservations are they emerge from treaties in which tribal nations make treaties with the federal government, and they reserve tracts of lands to themselves as they cede lands to the federal government, whether it's by choice or not. And generally it's not by choice. These are usually forced arrangements. And they force, ideally they want to establish relationships of friendship, but they also force these land cessions, Native people to give up their lands while they retain lands for themselves. This is where we get the word reservation. So in 1851, the most of this land mass is reserved as the Great Sioux Nation. But through time and the dirty dealings of the federal government, it gets whittled away. And by the 20th century, in mid-20th century, what we have are these small reservations here. There's 7 of them. Standing Rock is right here. It straddles North and South Dakota. But what happens in about 1940, in the 1940s, the US is coming out of the Great Depression. Federal policy is about infrastructure, building, a new economy through these massive infrastructure projects like dams. So the Pitzer Loan Act gets passed in 1944 to build 5 dams on the land. And it's, in theory, to control flooding and also to create these large reservoirs for irrigation for farmland. But what happens is when you build dams that create those reservoirs and lakes, it floods land and it displaces people. And that's exactly what happened with these dams. These dams altogether displaced over 900 families, according to Nick Estes, over 900 families. So that's thousands of people that the flooding, the building of dams and the flooding displaces them, forcing them out, having to move to other places, drowning village sites, drowning food resources, drowning timber resources, burials, all, kinds of places that are important, cultural places for the Lakota peoples of the Great Sioux Nation. So this is has massively devastating impacts for the people in the mid 20th century. So this, the massive displacement of these populations. Well, in the Columbia River watershed, on the other hand, something similar but very different actually happens. And this is the area where my ancestors are from, up on the Northern Columbia Plateau, which is this region up here. The Colville Indian Reservation is right here, spans over 1 million acres. And this is the Northern Columbia Plateau. And down here we see the Southern Columbia Plateau. There was a massive salmon fishery down here called Celilo Falls that was a very important fishing site and the center of culture in this part of the country. The salmon were the most important food cultural resource that we had in this entire area. So we consider ourselves salmon people. So in the early 1940s, the building of the Dalles Dam resulted in the flooding of Celilo Falls. And then, but just a few years earlier than that was the building of Grand Coulee Dam, which happened on our reservation without our consent, with promises to pay royalties of hydroelectricity that the dam was to provide or was to generate. Well, none of that ever happened until we sued them in 1997 to live up to their promise. But what happened in the meantime was the building of this dam on our land created this massive reservoir, and it floods our major fishing ground. We had a fishing ground like Celilo Falls that we called Kettle Falls, and it was the center of the culture for thousands of people in this region in the Northern Columbia Plateau and up into British Columbia. And then what happens? So we lose our fishing ground. Like it's like ripping the heart out of our cultures. No more salmon. And then what happens is they keep building dams on this, on the main stem of the Columbia and its tributaries. There are over 60 dams built on the Columbia River watershed. And the net impact of all that dam building has resulted in, the blockage of salmon runs, which has led to the collapse of salmon populations. Salmon populations, or salmon, is a keystone species. And that means that when you endanger a species that's a keystone species, or when it becomes extinct, it leads to a cascading effect of other extinctions. It impacts huge ecosystems and environments. And so that's what's happened. So we see two very different effects of dam building happening here in the West. On the other hand, we have something else going on here in this image here. It has nothing to do with dams or fish, but it has to do with uranium mining and how the history of uranium mining in the West in the 20th century has left massive environmental contamination in largely areas of native reservations, especially in the Four Corners region which is down here, and this, intensification of all these black dots are uranium mines. Most of them completely spent, but none of them cleaned up. There are over 1,000 of them just in the Four Corners area alone. And those, only a handful of them have ever been cleaned up. And so those areas are basically toxic waste dumps that are exposed to the elements. Radioactive materials seeps into the groundwater. It flies into the air because of the wind, and it's in the ground. So this is ongoing environmental contamination of tribal communities. And this is, so, when we talk about these incredible ecological impacts, it's very difficult there's no literature in the environmental justice literature talking about it in these ways, understanding these. It's not that the environmental justice literature doesn't cover these, it's that it doesn't understand these as very particular aspects of environmental injustice for Native people. And so, this is about challenging the narratives about modernity and progress, and how they have contributed to Indigenous death and Indigenous cultural genocide through the 20th century and before. So I also, in the book, one of the things I tried to do in the book and wanted to do in the book was something I had wanted to do for a long time, was to talk about the history of the environmental movement, because nobody had really done that, had written an extensive history of the environmental movement relative to Native peoples, especially with what we call second wave environmentalism, which emerges in the 1970s. We know that the conservation movement is sort of the precursor to the environmental movement, and as I wrote about in the book, the conservation movement is really built on narratives of the virgin wilderness, or the so-called pristine myth, which understands wilderness as something that humans are not part of. It comes as a result of, rampant urbanization in the East, and people having all this anxiety about losing the environment and poisoning the environment, and the need to set aside these areas of wilderness and to protect environment. And so, we have people early on, like, Henry David Thoreau and later John Muir, who become sort of the godfathers of these discourses and these ideas. But what's, not what hasn't been really highlighted in the literature, except by a handful of people, is how, this history of conservation and preservation to preserve the natural world are built on Indigenous dispossession and erasure. And that's particularly applicable to the establishment of the National Park Service. And the national parks, these big monuments that we have that are, set aside this land for public use. Well, the first, if we look at, especially the first three examples, begins with the establishment of Yosemite National Park in 1872, and that coincides, or it parallels this time of profound violence of the federal government, the cavalry running, rounding Native people up and forcibly pushing them on these reservations, which cuts them off from some of their traditional places, in places like the land that gets set aside in Yellowstone. That was all land that Native people lived on, they inhabited, they used, and now it gets set aside for wilderness. And as Mark David Spence has so clearly stated, he said when they did that, when they set aside these wilderness areas, he said wilderness had to first be created. So in other words, it really never was wilderness. It was always lands that people used, and now we're going to reimagine them as, unpeopled landscapes. So all of this is at the root of what becomes second wave environmentalism. It's white supremacy, supremacy and settler supremacy as the foundation for these conservation narratives, and all of that gets built into state structures, into the National Park Service, the National Forest Service, and dozens of environmental organizations in the early 20th century. And then by the time, it's so normalized that by the time, the counterculture happens in the 70s, it's so deeply embedded in American minds that it's really hard to see it. But something else happens. Native people, it's the civil rights movement, and Native people are fighting for civil rights too. And there's a new attention to, these ethnic nationalist movements. And there's a kind of a new respect that happens for Native people, and Native people are starting to be seen, and this environmental sensibility starts taking hold. We passed the Environmental Protection Act in 1970, I think it was, 69, right around there, after the Santa Barbara oil spill. And then the Keep America Beautiful campaign creates this crying Indian commercial. And if I had time, I would show that to you, but I don't think I have time to do that. But most of us, I imagine, have seen it. And the crying Indian commercial gives rise to this new stereotype. And this new stereotype is just a regurgitation of the old stereotype of the savage Indian, only it's repackaged now as in, a new noble savage stereotype about the ecological Indian. So the ecological Indian becomes the model that people are striving for, and young people, and the hippie movement. And so the hippies are looking to the Indians. They want to learn Indian wisdom. They start dressing like the Indians. They grow their hair long. They have beads and feathers, and they have headbands, and they live in teepees, and they are, so it's like this weird cultural appropriation that's happening that doesn't really have a name yet. We don't even have a term for that at the time, but it's really a fetishization of Native people. It's well intended, but ultimately this fetishism results in a type of cultural appropriation, which is nothing more than an ongoing form of erasure of actual Native people as white counterculture people come to imagine themselves as knowing what true Native culture really is supposed to be about. So it's all very, very complicated, but well intended, but still kind of twisted and kind of confusing, and like, we need to have a conversation about that. So this, as a process of erasure, this new this indigenous ecological environmentalism, this stereotyped version of it, it ignores like the actual indigenous knowledge systems that Native people have lived with for, since time immemorial. And it, has the impact of contributing to the ongoing erasure of that, which is already institutionalized. But these knowledge systems are, just to break it down for just a minute, these knowledge systems are systems based, they emerge out of very particular relationships to very particular ecological systems, ecosystems. So indigenous knowledge is based on landscapes that they inhabit and the knowledge that they know through the relationships with those landscapes. So because those are very particular, that means that there is no one monolithic indigenous knowledge system. It does mean that there are multiple kinds of indigenous knowledges, and they are based on very particular cultural epistemologies, which is just a way of saying ways of knowing, indigenous ways of knowing. And traditional ecological knowledge is one type of TEK. And we say that TEK is not just theoretical, it's actually applied knowledge based on indigenous land management practices. And gosh, I have a little video that I usually like to show, but I don't think I've got time to show that. So I'm gonna go past that so that we can talk a little bit more about decolonizing environmental justice. So this cultural appropriation and this ongoing erasure of indigenous people from the landscape, and the killing of, here's another word I'll lay on you, the killing of their knowledge systems, sometimes we refer to as epistemicide. And epistemicide refers to, just the killing of knowledge systems, because that's what happened through the history of the federal government colonizing Native people and doing things like sending them to boarding schools where their languages were taken away. And when you take away a language of a people, you take away the window that you take away that which narrates these ideas. And so it leads to, the chipping away of these knowledge systems. So the reverse of all of this is decolonizing these historical processes, and in decolonizing this thing that we call environmental justice. And how do we do that? It's obviously a really complicated question involving very complicated issues, but if we follow the logic, it means that that environmental justice activism theory and law and policy has to recognize that the US has this history and ongoing structure of colonialism, which is specific to Native people. And again, beyond this concept of race or racializing those populations. And it's got to recognize that Indigenous peoples, American Indian populations, have very different relationships to land based on these knowledge systems. It's not about private property. It's not about, a logic that puts the land to service in extractive ways, like, extracting minerals and extracting oil. Even though that stuff does happen on Indigenous lands, there our knowledge systems are not based on that. It's based on these the values of relationality, reciprocity, responsibility, and respect. That's the difference in these worldviews between Indigenous worldviews and mainstream Eurocentric dominant worldviews. This is why Indigenous peoples have been have lived sustainably for thousands of years, because they knew how to live in right relationship with the land. So that all has to be taken into consideration, these different epistemologies, worldviews. And that means the recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems has to be taken into account as well. Other examples include, the respect for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which enshrines several important rights for for Indigenous peoples, including self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent on their lands. This is sometimes called FPIC, FPIC, which goes beyond simple consultation. So really pushing for consent over consultation, because consent means what it says. Native people have to agree. Like, what would have happened if Standing Rock, if the Standing Rock Sioux people actually had the right of consent, as the U.S. says that it endorses in the Declaration. So this is a hypocrisy of the U.S. They endorse this document and this right to free, prior, and informed consent, but they don't apply it. And the fact that they didn't apply it is why Standing Rock happened, and that pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, actually got built. And then finally, land back, this thing that we call land back, that's gaining steam as a movement, which means, being able to speak that, like, justice means, giving land back, the land that was taken, give it back. And there's different ways that this can happen. It can happen through different kinds of title transfers, from fee simple to trust status, making it reservation land. Can happen through land trusts, and land conservations, and conservation easements, and also collaborative management regimes and co-management, relationships between entities of all kinds, including tribes and federal and state government agencies, and and other kinds of municipal, so government, upholding that government to government relationship in this way that returns jurisdiction to tribal nations. And so I just came across this painting the other day, and I think it's a perfect way to close this talk by showing, the visual representation of, what happens when we reverse that process of settler colonialism. Like, this is something that it might look like, a Native woman kind of bringing the spirit of Native people back, going west to east, where, now we can see what the modern world has really literally brought us. It's brought us all this environmental degradation, all this pollution, all these horrible industrial processes that have poisoned the land. And so this represents the returning of indigenous knowledge to the land, and bringing it back across the continent in a way that heals the land and heals the people at the same time. So that's how I'm thinking about this book. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. I don't want to get too much into what I'm thinking about in the next book, because I am writing another book following up on this project. But I would rather stop sharing the screen and start opening to discussion. So this is your opportunity to ask questions.
Great, Dina. Wonderful talk and presentation. So people can submit questions in the chat box. We already have I have lots of questions, but I'll let others ask away. We already have one. I'll read this to you. It says, can you expand on how the U.S. legal system was created in order to justify settler colonialism? It's multiple questions here. How successful can environmental law and community lawyering be in this with this limitation? Given the abundance of privilege in the crowd, how do you suggest privilege can be utilized to further decolonization if possible? So there's three questions there, and it's a big one.
It is a big one, and it's one of the many $million questions, in my opinion. So the system of federal Indian law was, as I said, created to justify settler colonialism and to justify the ongoing taking of land, and to legitimize it. And it did this through the creation of, Supreme Court decisions that established things like the doctrine of discovery, which is the foundation of the system that tells us that, because indigenous people are, they're inferior, they don't have superior knowledge like Europeans, and they're not, by virtue of being non-Christian, by the way, this is not about race, it's about Christianity. that the bestowing of Christianity on Indigenous peoples this is the language used in this decision, Johnson v. McIntosh, that it affords an apology, and gives address, even though it's a pretense of the conquest, because they even admit it's really not about conquest, but. So the doctrine of discovery, which is now that central doctrine, the doctrine of domestic dependent nations, in which says that Native people are, it's like it's an imagined thing that somehow Native people, agreed to become dependent on the U.S., which was not the case, and that there's dozens of other decisions and pieces of legislation that whittle down and Native power and decision making and jurisdiction over their own lands. And so this is one of the big elephants in the living room of the colonial state. Like we think that justice, that law is a system of justice, but for Native people, it's really been a system of injustice. That's not to say that there aren't times that some of that the law can work in our favor, because it can, but overall, it's a system of domination that keeps Native people disempowered and subsumed to the US state. So like we have to be willing to call that out. Like even lawyers, people practicing Indian law, like let's be real about what's really going on here. And there has to, at some point on some level, be a willingness to repudiate some of these very hegemonic legal structures and frameworks and doctrines. So that's kind of long-term strategy in my mind. Like ultimately, like if you're going to decolonize, it's got to happen in the legal system, but there's very little of that going on. Why? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that lawyers take oaths of allegiance to the Constitution. I see that as a problem, but so there's a huge conversation about this, but that's kind of how I think about it. It's the structure that's the problem, and problematic doctrines like stare decisis, let the precedent stand. Why can't we overturn precedents like the doctrine of discovery or domestic dependent nationhood? Why is it that cannot be overturned? It's based on 19th century racist logic. Why can't we overturn that? So,
well, the chat's blowing up. Let me go on to the next question. How do you envision decolonization in terms of land returns, or in other forms, in urban spaces where settler societies and infrastructures exist, i.e. American cities and towns?
Well, there's examples of that. An example that on very micro scales, let's put it that way. In San Francisco, we have the Segura Land Trust. This is a very tiny piece of property. It's 1/4 of an acre in Oakland. And that began as, somebody owning property and returning it, wanting to return it to Native people. But that because there is no federally recognized tribe in that area that can receive the land in trust and make it a reservation, it had to be organized in this alternative way as a land trust and organized as a 501c3. Because it's not technically a tribe. So that's one example of these different kinds of alternative structures that Native people are using to get land returned. In others, there's no reason why that model can't be replicated in other places in urban spaces. And there's probably other examples that I'm blanking on, not thinking of right now, but that is a perfect example of how in urban spaces, this act of decolonization this type of active decolonization can happen.
Questions and one of and